Hello and welcome back to Making the Argument. Well, today we're going to be discussing a pretty significant strike that Iran launched against Israel. We're going to discuss why this strike took place, why it matters to the United States and the Middle East, what it could potentially mean for a broader war between Israel and Iran. And one of the questions that we're really going to dig into here is, should the U.S. get involved? And if it didn't, could Israel actually stand up to and defeat Iran in a conflict? All of that and more coming up on this episode of Making the Argument, brought to you by Good Ranchers.
Thank you all for joining us on this episode. If you haven't already, go down to the link in the description and join our community chat. We have a great group of folks over there discussing all of the topics that we talk about here on this podcast, and we'd love for you to join. We'd love to get to know you there. So if you haven't already, go click that link, join our community chat, and we'll see you there.
All right, going around the table, I am your host, Nick Freitas, and for the purposes of this episode, I'll also mention that I used to dabble in counterinsurgency and unconventional warfare back when I served in the military, active duty for 11 years, to include a couple of tours over in Iraq, so I've got a little bit of experience with this area. With us, back in the studio, my beautiful bride, Tina, Queen of the Bees.
Hello, everyone.
And then we have our resident historian, political prognosticator, and mostly benevolent warlord in training. Still going through some of the training. How you doing, Christian?
I'm doing fine.
And then, of course, we have our producer of producers, Nicholas Hamilton, the good Hamilton, the one that doesn't like central banking.
Thank you, Nick.
Okay, let's go ahead and jump right into this. As we look at what has been going on in the Middle East, right, there was this idea during the Trump administration that we were actually starting to see a lot more peace talks that were taking place. We had the Abrahamic Accords. And generally speaking, there was this idea that tensions were starting to cool within the Middle East. And there was a lot of different factors that played into this, right? Obviously, the Trump administration will take credit for a lot of it, and there was a lot of good things that they did. They got people to come to the table, which was excellent. You also started to see different trade opportunities, which was also influencing decisions. You also saw the rise of Iran as a threat to other countries within the Middle East. And it's important to understand this dynamic. Sometimes I think in the West, we get this idea that Islamic countries are all pretty much walking in lockstep with similar goals and objectives. And that is absolutely not the case. There's obviously a great deal of infighting, some of it tribal in nature, some of it religious in nature between Shia and Sunni, as well as different sects within Sunni and Shiism. And so it's important to understand that countries like Saudi Arabia are very, very concerned about the threat that a country like Iran poses to them. And so you will find, common goals, common objectives between some of these countries. A lot of that is directed toward the existence of the state of Israel. But in many other areas, you actually see a great deal of hostility between them. And one of the things that we actually saw with the peace accords taking place and more countries coming to the table ready to at least negotiate some sort of acknowledgement for Israel's right to exist was a move in the right direction, but it was also something that I think Iran was very concerned about. And we need to understand that Iran is the primary funder of Hamas and Hezbollah. Hamas primarily operating out of Gaza and Hezbollah primarily operating out of Lebanon, not to mention the fact that Iran has a number of other organizations and paramilitary groups that they utilize in order to conduct and or support terrorist attacks. So we've got to if we really wanted to start this, we would go back centuries. We're not going to do that today. We are going to talk about October 7th. Very briefly, just to kind of put some context in here, because obviously October 7th is one of the things that took place that just completely any positive movement that was taken in the Middle East was completely upset by the attacks on October 7th in Israel. It's also important for Americans to understand the scale of these attacks. 1,200 Israelis were killed. Several hundred were kidnapped and held hostage in anticipation of an Israeli response. To give you an idea of what this would mean if it was directed to the United States, if we looked at Israel's population relative to the United States population, this would be the equivalent of someone doing a lightning strike into the United States, killing roughly 40,000 people, and then taking thousands of people and holding them hostage in anticipation of American military response, right? So that kind of puts this in perspective of what a huge deal this was, because every once in a while we can look at numbers and not be appropriately impressed with just how horrible something really was until you're actually living within the context that Israel is a very, very small country, that it is constantly finding itself in a state of conflict, either with terrorist organizations or for most of its country's history with the conventional militaries of their neighbors. And so Israel has kind of operated off of this mindset, and they were just getting to this point where it looked like things were getting better, and then all of a sudden it was dashed, and now we're constantly wondering whether or not this is going to drastically escalate. So important to understand that October 7th really, really changed the dynamic in the Middle East right now, the modern dynamic in the Middle East. And by modern, I'm talking about the last probably 6 or 7 years. It's also important to understand who is funding organizations like Hamas. Yes, they were actually elected. Hamas was elected to represent the Palestinians in Gaza. By the same token, they're heavily financed by Iran. Same thing with Hezbollah in Lebanon. When this attack took place, the Israeli government under Benjamin Netanyahu has always been a little bit more hawkish toward terrorist organizations, but even Benjamin Netanyahu has offered different peace deals and things of that nature. But you need to understand that regardless of where you were in Israeli society, left, right, because there's actually a very, very robust, left of center and left-wing political parties within Israel, everyone was fairly unified about attacking Hamas and attacking them incredibly hard. And part of that is about understanding the nature of who was attacked in Israel. A lot of the attacks that were taking place was at a music festival, it was at a series of kibbutz. And if you look at what a kibbutz is kind of a collectivist farming community. These are usually comprised of people that tend to be a little bit more on the left, tend to be a lot more conciliatory toward Palestinian demands with respect to land and to peace deals. And so for them to get attacked and be attacked this hellaciously, I think for some people, and I certainly don't want to speak for them or pretend like I know more than they do about it, but felt somewhat of a betrayal that the very people that were actually more sympathetic to Palestinian political objectives were the very ones that were actually targeted by Hamas for such a brutal attack. And again, I think this kind of steeled some of Israel's resolve to not only conduct surgical strikes, but to actually go in, fully invade Gaza with the intention of this time they're going to destroy Hamas. And we've had several episodes where we've talked about what were Iran's potential objectives for this. Did Hamas launch this attack without Iran's knowledge? I personally don't think they did, but there's an argument to be made that, Iran might have had some heads up with October 7th, but not have green-lighted it. I think they probably did. But everyone was kind of wondering what is going to happen, right? Israel's going to strike. They're going to strike hard, and they have. And then you saw the moral equivalency arguments taking place almost immediately. And you saw it from both the left and elements of the right. And one of the things that we are going to highlight a little bit just in this beginning portion is talking about the nature of support for Israel in the United States, when we look at it on the left, has been significantly diminished. And if you look at why the left has, in many cases, kind of withdrawn popular support for Israel, it's rooted around this idea of critical theory, right? This idea of separating society into those who are the oppressors and those who are the oppressed. And if you look at pretty much every college campus, you have left-wing organizations coming out in support of either the Palestinians or some of them actually directly in support of Hamas. And when you see chants like "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," you can debate all day long on whether or not you think that's directly anti-Semitic or you think it's more political in nature. But the bottom line is that that phrase is rooted in the belief that the state of Israel should not exist. And I think it's fair to ask, okay, what would happen to the Jewish population if the state of Israel did not exist? Because last time I checked, there doesn't seem to be a very robust Jewish population in other Arab countries within the region, right? So I think it's fair to assume that if organizations like Hamas were suddenly running the show in the Levant, it probably wouldn't go over that well for Jewish people. And so it's fair for Jewish people to say, when you say "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," what does that mean for us? Not to mention the fact that there seems to be kind of this ridiculous assertion that, well, Israel didn't exist until 1947. No. All right. Israel and a Jewish population living within the Levant, within this period of the Middle East, have been there since the Bronze Age. Right. So this idea that simply because the modern Jewish state, the modern Israeli state is new, that somehow there's no larger ancestral claim is ridiculous, especially when you start to look at the history of that region, which we went into in great detail in another episode. So on the left, it's kind of this critical theory, oppressed versus oppressor, and now the Israelis have been put into the oppressor column, and Jews are being treated very badly on a lot of college campuses by a lot of different activist organizations. On the right, you're seeing something a little bit different. And there's kind of three categories I would suggest. One is just, again, you see the same thing on the left. There's certain elements of the left that maybe they don't buy into critical theory, but they are just blatantly anti-Semitic, right? And that's a racist only argument. And that's obviously horrible and immoral. You have certain elements on the right that also probably fit into this category. You have another category where I wouldn't suggest that it was necessarily like just, fundamentally motivated by racism, but you do have people that seem to be engaging in this same thing that the critical theorists are doing with their oppressor or oppressed. But on the right, you have certain people that are like breaking into that camp of enemy and friend. And if they associate you with, different institutions or organizations, whether it be Hollywood, whether it be the media, anything like that they feel is directly attacking the United States and their beliefs, well, then they start to, I would argue, inappropriately associate you with those things, with those attacks. And that's very problematic because it becomes very easy for someone to make a superficial characterization, or they make a characterization based exclusively off of immutable characteristics as opposed to your individual actions and say, okay, this person is now my enemy. Like, I blatantly reject that because ultimately that ends up being rooted in racism too. The third category that you're seeing kind of on the right is this idea of it is a version of America First, which says, look, this isn't about, for this individual on the right, they might say, this isn't about being Jewish any more than it's about being Ukrainian, any more than it's about being Iranian or Russian or anything else. What they're frustrated about, and you see this really popular meme going around where it shows rockets going in one direction and rockets being returned fire in the other direction, and it says, my tax dollars, and then on the other side it says, somehow also my tax dollars. They are tired of the United States constantly involving themselves, whether it's by financing, providing weapons, or actually engaging in combat operations. They're tired of the United States making everything else in the world a priority over what they believe should be domestic priorities. Right now, again, I can have a conversation with someone like that all day long who says, like, Nick, I just don't want foreign aid going anywhere. Like, until we fix the border, until we fix our own issues, I'm tired of us financing issues going on in the rest of the world. And that's all this is about. I wish Israel the best. I hope they win, but I don't think it's the United States' responsibility. That's their position. And so out of all those positions, whether it be on the left or on the right, I'm going to tell you right now, my position is I reject anything that wants to classify an entire group of people as being a problem or being associated with a particular way of thinking. I think you have to take people as individuals. I certainly don't want to be judged by what someone who might look like me or have my similar ancestry might have done yesterday or 100 years from now or 1,000 years ago, right? Like, that's not fair to me, and I'm not going to do that to other people. For the people that take that position, that really what this is about for them is like, I'm tired of prioritizing other problems, other areas, other regions. I want to prioritize American problems. I get where they're coming from. And today what we're going to talk about is a little bit about how does U.S. foreign policy impact what's going on in the rest of the world, and how does it ultimately impact us as citizens? And if you do have strong feelings one way or the other, and I have strong feelings against organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, like very strong. The question is okay, what is the appropriate way to address that, both as an individual, maybe as a part of organizations, and then what is a country's responsibility? So let's talk a little bit about what did this attack from Iran into Israel, which when it first happened, I mean, I know Christian was texting me and I think Tina did as well. We were like, well, this could get really, really bad, really, really quick. And it seems to have kind of, I don't want to say, petered out or calmed down, because it's still the elephant in the room right now is what is Israel going to do in response? But to give everyone some context, there was a strike on an Iranian consulate in Damascus in Syria. It was suspected that the Israelis were behind it because they were targeting certain military personnel and personnel within the Iranian government. Again, suspected. I don't know that it's been confirmed yet. But Iran lost I think they lost 7 people in the attack, and they lost 2 high-ranking government officials, to include one, a general within the military, handling some. some of the units that handle a lot of the terrorist coordination and terrorist support training and attacks that take place in Israel. So you can argue, was this a legitimate military target, or because it's a consulate, was it not? Hey, was the consulate being used for activities that are not covered under general protections with respect to laws of war, diplomatic immunity, things of that nature? Argue that all day long. Iran came to the conclusion that it was Israel, and they felt the need to strike back. So they launched, let me go ahead and get the numbers here correct, because this was pretty significant. They launched more than 300 projectiles, including around 170 drones, and over 120 ballistic missiles were fired toward Israel in the immense aerial attack overnight. Approximately 350 rockets were fired from Iran, Iraq, Yemen, and Lebanon's Hezbollah, according to IDF spokesperson Daniel Hagari. So that's significant. That's a massive attack. Again, I think did they say it was the largest single drone attack in history?
Drone attack, which is interesting because there's currently a war going on in Ukraine right now where drone attacks are almost like a weekly occurrence from both sides directed at military targets, although on the Russians, they also target civilian and infrastructure targets as well. So it's not like the Iranians don't have any competition right now when it comes to drone strikes.
Yeah.
And when I say drone strikes, I don't mean in an isolated sense. I mean swarms of them, right? And
well, and we're also not talking about the sort of drone strikes that are usually associated with the United States, where you have something like a Predator drone, where you literally have someone in Nevada flying a drone that's operating in the Middle East and then shooting a Hellfire missile at something. We're talking about drones that actually go in and explode.
They're basically very tiny missiles.
Yeah.
I mean, which is interesting because Iran also sent cruise missiles after Israel as well. And I believe you brought this up earlier. Like, what kind of sets this apart is the fact that Iran and Israel, there's no love lost between the two of those, right? They've been mortal enemies since the Iranian Revolution in the 1970s. But this is the first time ever that Iran directly, not indirectly, attacked Israel. So you could make the argument, we ultimately don't know yet, whether or not Iran told Hamas to attack Israel on October 7th. We know that Hamas is heavily aligned with Iran.
Yeah.
But we don't really, and we've speculated.
I'm in the camp where I think they did, or they at least gave the green light. Other people think that, maybe Iran wasn't as clear on what was going to happen or the scope of what was going to take place. And there's arguments to be made for both sides.
More clearly, we also know that Iran is the number one supplier of weapons to Hezbollah in Lebanon. And we also know that Iran is a huge ally of the Houthis in Yemen.
Yeah.
And so Iran has a network of alliances stretched across the Middle East. And there's traditionally been two, arguably three if you count the United States, but traditionally two enemies that they've been fighting indirectly using these allies to basically fight proxy battles. The first is actually Saudi Arabia. The second is obviously Israel. Now, the reason that I bring up Saudi Arabia is because it's kind of interesting. You have almost a bit of a Mexican standoff here because Saudi Arabia traditionally is considered the kind of like the head of the Sunni wing of Islam in the Middle East, whereas obviously Iran is the head of the Shia wing. There's big religious divides. There's also ethnic divides. So Saudi Arabia is, by definition, an Arab country. Most of these countries in the Middle East are Arab countries. Iran is an Aryan country. That's literally what the name Iran means. It's Persian for the land of the Aryans. And so there's an ethnic divide there, and that goes back thousands of years, right? And so even though the Islamic conquests ended up converting Persia from Zoroastrianism to Islam, first off, it didn't convert it to the same type of Islam as the rest of the Arab world. Second off, it didn't result in some sort of demographic replacement of the Persian people. They're still Persians. And so there's been geopolitical divides between Iran and some of these other powers in the region, arguably even before the Iranian Revolution. But post-revolution, that's been ramped up to 11, basically.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating about all of this is that usually Iran has been hesitant to directly get involved. Again, they
fight through proxies.
Yeah, they fight through proxies. It's basically it's a miniature Cold War in the Middle East. What's happened in the last couple days and really couple weeks is unprecedented in the sense that Israel and Iran are directly attacking each other. Now, they're not doing it, well, Iran did try to do it on Israeli territory, but like Israel attacked Iran in that building that was apparently like a consulate
Allegedly.
of some sort.
Yeah. They're widely
that was in Syria.
Responsible. Yeah.
And Syria's government is considered somewhat aligned to Iran. They're also aligned to the Russians. Although they're currently fighting a civil war, so it's not like Syria is capable of really doing much about it right now. But Iran retaliates, right, by directly attacking Israel. Now, we say that 99% of the drones and cruise missiles got shot down, which is true.
Well, that's important. That's important to mention here because a lot of it was Iron Dome, right, which the United States in parts helps fund through because it's expensive. But it's basically like it marks the trajectory of anything flying into Israeli airspace, and then it automatically locks onto that and shoots off a response in order to hopefully hit it in midair and minimize any sort of damage. You also had U.S. ships that were firing on these incoming ballistic missiles as well.
The French and British as well.
Yeah.
And who else was the Jordanians? They sent their Air Force up to intercept some of the drones that were coming and missiles that were coming from the Houthis.
There was also U.S. Patriot missile batteries that were also involved in stopping. And again, part of this was because Iran actually signified that they were going to be launching this attack in retaliation for what happened in Damascus, which was, this is the part where, and anybody that's looking at this going, why is this going this way? And why isn't Biden doing this? Or why aren't the Israelis doing that? Okay, Iran coming out and saying, hey, we're mad about what happened over here. We're going to attack you. And then going through, I think it was the Swedes and Sweden and somebody else.
Switzerland as well.
And Switzerland to kind of like notify the United States that, hey, we're going to retaliate. And then basically this wasn't a surprise attack under the October 7th was. And so that's why a lot of countries from the UK to France to the United States, I think have in part, I don't think this completely explains their process, but have in part tried to tell the Israelis to not try to respond in kind. And part of it was because that assistance from the United States as well as Israeli Defense Forces stopping it, like over 300 projectiles launched into Israel, nobody killed. And there was just some minor structural damage at a air base in southern Israel. I mean, Joe Biden said one of the dumbest things he possibly could have is he looked at Netanyahu and said, take the win. It's like, dude, somebody trying to like beat you up and you escaping any damage is not a win, right? In the sense that that guy still tried to beat you and there needs to be retaliation, right? And again, Netanyahu and these Israelis have said that they will be retaliating against Iran. We're just not sure what that looks like at this point. And that's the thing. There's a lot of it becomes really, really difficult to predict what is going to happen next. What's not difficult to predict, though? Good Ranchers. Because if you order Good Ranchers, you go onto goodranchers.com, you put in promo code Nick, and you get a subscription right now, they're going to lock you into the price of your subscription that you did today all the way through 2026. Right? That sort of pricing shield that they are putting up around your meat that you buy from them, that they deliver directly to your door, some of the finest American raised beef, poultry, pork, wild-caught seafood, right? You get locked into the same price with everything going on, with the Federal Reserve being the Federal Reserve, right? With the federal government being the federal government. Wouldn't it be nice to know that your subscription that brings you delicious steak and bacon and wings and everything else, that's going to continue to come, be delivered to your door at the price agreed upon back in 2024? I mean, that's incredible. GoodRanchers.com, promo code Nick. Go over there, sign up for one of those subscriptions, get locked into that price shield, as well as some other benefits that you're going to get as well. Go ahead and check that out. Okay.
That was a 9 out of 10 ad transition. It could have only been better if you had said, this is an Iron Dome against inflation.
Yeah, I part of me, so just so you know, I'm not just saying this. I was thinking about that, but I thought it might be inappropriate. But I'm glad you said it. I'm glad you said it.
I'm starting to see like this slight change in Nick's face and then a tone difference to where I'm pretty sure the ad's coming.
Yeah.
Oh,
I'm starting to see it. I'm
starting
sure
to telegraph it more.
Our audience is
Well, I'll
starting.
just have to
He's been
mix it up
taking
better.
hints from the Iranians who are apparently telegraphing their text. Actually, that's something that I personally, and I haven't had a chance to talk to you about this until now. So it's a great setting since we're on the show. Like, why do you think Iran basically did everything possible to telegraph everybody except Israel and America directly? They didn't contact them directly, but they did enough stuff to make it obvious that the information would get to them days in advance that they would be launching this drone and missile strike on Israel. Why do you think they did that?
I think everybody has this idea that other countries operate in these kind of like monolithic, like, oh, Iran did this. It's like, well, no, the Iranian government wanted to strike back. They have to maintain credibility within elements in their own country. Like this idea that, the Ayatollah is kind of, he's there and he's technically in charge of the government, but there's a whole other government structure within Iran that operates a lot of your day-to-day operations. And they have to maintain credibility with the elements within their country, which hate Israel, which want to see Iran take more of kind of an extreme position with respect to this fight, right? For them, this is a moral issue. And to lose high-ranking government officials at a consulate in Damascus and not respond in a way that your own population can say, okay, yeah, we didn't take it lying down. This is about saving face. And sometimes I think all of us understand the importance of saving face on some level, but can I just say, having spent a little time in this area of the world, it's really important. By the same token, Iran knows that directly attacking Israel is crossing a line they haven't crossed before. Iran also knows that their military is just not that great. One of the reasons why they engage in the sort of operations that they do is because the last time they really tangled with a sophisticated military power, that being the United States, they got their crap handed to them really quick. We did an episode where we talked a little bit about Reagan's response to Iran when they were mining areas of the Persian Gulf, and a U.S. vessel was hit. And the response was we sunk half their Navy, right? So Iran understands that there's a huge power disparity when it comes to direct combat operations against a sophisticated Western military, which is essentially, even though Israel's not, it's considered part of the West, even though it's, not obviously in the West. But their military performs at an incredibly effective and efficient and high tempo and high degree of professionalism. And Israel has demonstrated this several times over in conflicts in the Middle East. I want to say, I believe Israel's defense budget is actually larger than Iran's, and their equipment is far more sophisticated. So for Iran to get involved, to escalate it to a degree to where Israel, which is in many respects more unified politically than it's been in some time, for them to launch another surprise attack and to, let's say, specifically target civilian populations as opposed to military populations, because they did target predominantly just an air base, right? You could argue that's a strategic military target. It's not like they were just sending drones into elementary schools. So by them making it a targeted response against what would be considered to be a legitimate military target, they've escalated in the sense that they attacked Israel directly, so that allows them to go back to their own population and say, look what we did. But then with enough warning, they also knew that there wasn't going to be so much significant damage as for the Israeli population to demand a very, very stringent and devastating attack against Iran, or to put the United States in a position where just using air power, our own drone strikes or whatnot, we could do a lot to the Iranian economy and military. I think the other thing that they don't want is, and this is something that's important to understand about the difference between the Biden administration and the Trump administration. When Trump came into office, right, we've had sanctions on Iran for quite some time. A lot of that associated with any sort of materials that you could use for weapons, nuclear weapons, also oil exports and things of that nature. But there'd been like a waiver. There'd been a waiver for a while that allowed Iran to sell up to like 1 million barrels of oil a day or something like that. But the funding was only supposed to go toward, their economy. It wasn't supposed to go toward their military and things like that, which we all know is kind of ridiculous because money's fungible. If you tell me, hey, I'm going to give you $10 billion, but you can't spend it on tanks, then I'm going to say, okay, great. I'm going to take this $10 billion that I had allocated for wheat. I'm now going to spend that on tanks, and the $10 billion you gave me, I'll now spend on wheat, right? So you've effectively achieved the same thing. Trump actually removed that waiver. And Iranian oil exports, I think, were out to like 300,000 barrels a day or something like that. Don't quote me directly on those numbers, but I think I'm in the ballpark. Well, that's a significant price difference. Biden comes in and essentially completely, puts the waivers back in place. Iran right now, I think, is up to over $3 million barrels of oil a day. To give you an idea of what this actually means for their economy, that's the equivalent of them being able to double their entire defense budget of like $10 billion. That's massive. And so I don't think it's a huge shock that the combination of Joe Biden completely botching the exit from Afghanistan, knowing that the American people are war weary, knowing that COVID devastated economies throughout the world, and Iran now all of a sudden being flush with cash because the Biden administration essentially removed significant sanctions that were crippling their ability to spend money on terrorist attacks and everything else. All of those things happening at once created conditions where I think Iran's overall understands that they have someone in the White House right now that's a lot easier for them to negotiate with in order to get access to billions of dollars that they would not otherwise have. And that also, I think, factors into the way they plan their strikes and they plan their operations.
Don't you think that the telegraphing what they were about to do, don't you think some of it was getting ahead of the story too? I mean, they needed to really make sure everyone knew this was a retaliation. Yes. And not out of the blue. And so to try to get public opinion here to go, well, Israel kind of had it coming.
I think maybe to some degree, I think they
gave Biden an out on that.
No, I definitely think that they don't want to put, look, Biden has been good for the Iranian regime. I know that's going to sound like super hyperbolic, but what would you call it if all of a sudden, if somebody came into office in a foreign country and then all of a sudden the United States was able to double their defense budget because of new money we would all say that person was favorable to the United States.
Remember that
the Biden administration has been favorable to the Iranian regime. And we know this because even after October 7th, after those attacks, Biden didn't go back and say, hey, we're putting these sanctions back on. Like, holy hell, dude, what does it take for you to actually,
remember the meme that you brought up at the beginning of the show, the rockets from one direction, the rockets from the other direction, and it's, my tax dollars, somehow also my tax dollars. That is literally true in the case of Iran, because obviously, and this is a criticism that some people have, but, we sent a tremendous amount of foreign aid to Israel, but we were sending literal pallets of cash to the Iranians. It wasn't that long ago. And that like money is fungible. And so we can say all day long, like, this agreement that, where we're supplying the Iranians money. Well, it's not for their military. Yeah, great. But it frees up money that can be spent on their military. So anytime that we're giving a foreign country money, that money can be spent on anything because money is fungible. And so in a way, you could actually describe the Israeli attack on that supposed consulate in Damascus and the Iranian response with the drone strikes and the cruise missile strikes as both of those being funded by American tax dollars. And entirely different mechanisms and ways, but there's American money behind both of that in some cases very long, convoluted ways, right? In other ways, just very direct ways, in the sense that we were literally supplying the Iranians money as part of an agreement to try to basically appease them and stop them from funding, terrorist groups like the Houthis or Hamas or Hezbollah. So, and obviously that didn't work, right? Because they're still supporting those organizations. So it's, in one way, I understand why Iran kind of telegraphed their intentions here. It was supposed to be a PR spectacle with a minimal amount of casualties or damage, in order to shore up the regime and demonstrate, look, you cannot strike our, consulate buildings in foreign countries where our diplomatic officials are operating there without impunity, because at that point, you're not a nation, right?
Yeah.
If anybody can just attack you with impunity, you're
when in Israel's position is like, and you don't get to finance terrorist attacks in our country with impunity either. And so they wanted to make Iran feel the pain more directly. This is actually one of the things I respected about the Trump administration is when they bombed the U.S. embassy, he didn't say, okay, let's invade Iran. He didn't say, let's deploy a division and try to, turn something into a stable democracy over the next 20 years. He isolated the people that were responsible for planning the attack and killed them. I actually think that's a far more powerful deterrent in some respects.
That's a big shift from the George Bush and even Barack Obama eras. Yeah. And it's one that I think a lot of Americans on the right that have become war weary, have adopted a more America first foreign policy, have looked at some of our own big problems like our southern border that we've talked about at length and how that's wide open. And Biden has invited a mass migrant crisis unlike anything this country's ever seen in almost 250 years. There's a lot of people on the right that see the response that the Trump administration took in the Middle East, and we're like, I want more of that, because there was stability without the need for American boots on the ground, without the need for another Middle Eastern war. And not only that, but it was Trump's administration that was really pushing the peace process that you saw pick up in a big way with like the Abraham Accords, where Israel was starting to open up diplomatic relations with certain Arab countries that it had never had relations with. And then Biden gets into office, and look at where things are right now. The Middle East is more chaotic now today than at any point since the Yom Kippur War.
Yeah,
most likely.
I think that's fair. You could argue maybe in the early 80s with the invasion of Lebanon and whatnot, but yeah, pretty close. Here's what I'll also say is, because I want to talk about one other thing first, because I want to actually go into that. Like, what is for people that actually believe that, yes, American priorities should be prioritized when it comes to our federal government, and we don't need to be going off and starting new wars. Like, I'm a big believer in a far less interventionist foreign policy. It's not to say that I don't think foreign intervention is never appropriate or never necessary, but I'm a lot more strict on when we should do it and when we should stay out of it. But before that, I want to talk a little bit about what do we think Israel will do in response to this? Because just like the Iranian regime has to ensure that elements within its own country are satisfied by the result without escalating it to a point where they could find themselves in some really serious trouble, Israel has to do the same. And one of the things that I think the Biden administration and a lot of Western countries have don't quite understand yet is the amount of credibility they have lost, I think, with the Israeli people, in part because there's always been this idea that, well, hey, look, we give you a ton of foreign aid, we give you a ton of military equipment, and so therefore when we say don't do something, don't do it. And there's been many cases where I think Israel has probably abided by that, other cases where they probably subverted it. But I think after October 7th, the way that Israel saw certain college protests, the way they saw certain American politicians and Western politicians in general, and this constant drumbeat of whenever Hamas does something, well, it's because Hamas is so poor and oppressed, and look at this, oh my gosh, it's so horrible. But whenever Israel responds, it's like, well, you guys need to be the good guys. You need to make sure that you're not, oh, no, that's too much. We need a ceasefire now. And I think Israel was just like, screw this. We have been through this for decades now, where we're always the ones getting, we get blindsided, we get attacked, and then we've got to pull back before we can actually finish the job. And we're not doing it this time. This was so egregious and so horrible that screw you. It's not worth it. And honestly, think about it. If you're Israel to some degree, you're looking at France and going, what are you going to do about it? Like, what are you really going to do about it? You know, there are so many countries in the West, especially European countries, that love to talk a good game, but really what they want to do is sit around a table in Brussels and do sharp notes of protest. Like, we're going to send you a letter. Ha-ha. Like, Israel's like, piss off. I mean, we're fighting for our existence here, and we don't care if you're angry about us. What is Joe Biden calling for a ceasefire and Jimmy cracking corn have in common? I don't care, right? That's what it has in common.
Oh my God.
Because, no, seriously, if you were living under that, that's probably where you're at right now. Yeah. Is that we're not going to sit here and fight this slow war of attrition against, terrorist organizations that can just attack us with impunity whenever they want, and we're not allowed to finish the job. And I think that's where we're at. But I do think that Israel also understands, I think Netanyahu also understands that this was done a little bit differently, right? This was not the typical Iranian-backed attack in Israel. And I think what's going to happen is they're still going to hit back. They're going to find a way to do it that they can also save face with their population who's saying, no, we don't put up with this crap anymore, without completely losing the support specifically of the United States, because that relationship is incredibly important to Israel. And as much as Israel has had an incredible amount of success in their wars, whether it be in 47, 48, or again in 67 or 73, like in 73, a lot of U.S. military equipment and funding was coming in the Israelis were doing the fighting, but we were providing a lot of logistical support for them to be able to fight back against the combined attacks of Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Iraq. So I think Israel is going to respond. I think the United States, and people sometimes get mad at Israel. They think that Israel has way too strong a lobbying power within U.S. Congress. And I think that's fueled from two things. One is I think you have a lot of Americans, especially usually on the right, on the evangelical Christian side, that see us as having a special relationship with Israel that is not just realpolitik. It's not just that we have a strategic partner in the Middle East that gives us access to that area. I think there's what is considered to be a very moral component and moral obligation to an ally. Now, maybe you don't believe that, maybe you don't like that, maybe you don't want that to be the case, but it is the case. And I don't think that's as simple as saying, oh, well, the Israelis are doing. There are countries all over the world desperately trying to lobby the United States Congress because of the amount of money that the United States Congress allocates in foreign aid spending. It makes sense when you're the biggest kid on the block with the biggest military on the block. It makes sense that other countries who see them as kind of natural or ideological allies with you are going to want to have influence with respect to your legislative process and your budget and allocation process. Now, again, we can certainly fight back against the idea of how prevalent should that be, but I think it's a little bit ridiculous to suggest to the Israelis that they shouldn't be, that they shouldn't be interested in making sure that the people that again allocate the budget or make decisions about troop deployments are friendly to Israel. Like, why wouldn't they do that? Wouldn't you on some level consider it kind of a dereliction of duty on their part if they weren't actively trying to foster good relations with the United States? Again, I'm not saying you got to like how they're doing it. I'm not saying you got to like the level of lobbying influence. But if you were Israeli, wouldn't you be doing that? Wouldn't that be a part of your strategy?
I don't think anybody questions the motivations of the Israelis in what they're doing, because it makes logical sense why they're doing it. I think that the issue that you see, certainly on the right, actually, let's pause that for just a second. The left, it's pretty clear where they're coming from. They operate on an oppressor-oppressed framework where if you fall into the oppressor category, you are the source of all evil and you must be decolonized, right? I mean, we saw what happened on October 8th, even before an Israeli response to the attack, and you had people on the left taking to the streets in cities like New York, chanting "Globalize the Intifada," and cheering on about how Hamas had, quote unquote, taken out a bunch of hipsters at a music festival.
Yeah. And what did you think decolonization would look like?
And you saw tweets from people being like, oh, you're a bunch of losers if you didn't think that this is what decolonization looked like. Oh, good to hear. Thank you for telling us that it's not just contained to the sociology department of some woke university, that this is actually what the practical effects of your ideology leads to. Just butchering people. Right? Making no distinction between military targets and civilian targets. Yeah. So we know how the left approaches this topic. On the right, there's a little bit more nuance here. So yes, people can point out like, oh, there's anti-Semites. Yeah, but that doesn't necessarily explain the whole thing. In fact, it doesn't even explain the whole thing on the left, because the left operates, again, on an oppressor-oppressed mindset. It wasn't that long ago the Jews were considered the oppressed. Yeah. For obvious reasons, right? I mean, going back to the whole story behind the creation of Israel in the aftermath of World War II.
Truman.
And this also explains why traditionally progressive movements in the United States have been until recently, been far more pro-Israel than anybody else, because they're operating in that oppressor-oppressed mindset. This is also why a huge number of Jewish Americans are very loyal to the Democratic Party. Not all of them. We know that there's like some ultra-conservative sects, ultra-Orthodox sects that are actually very far on the right. And then there's also the Messianic Jews, the Jews that are Christians. They're ethnically Jewish, but they're Christians, and they tend to be more conservative as well. But overall, Jewish Americans tend to be pretty far on the left in terms of their voting habits. And so we understand the left's mindset, which you can change depending on how it gets them to acquire more political power. Yeah. You could be one day considered oppressed and the next day be considered an oppressor. Whatever enables the left in order to obtain political power, they'll lump you in the category, right?
Well, that's why you see ridiculous signs like, Queers for Palestine, knowing that like, okay, if Hamas was running the show,
like I said, diversity is our strength.
There wouldn't be a lot of rainbow flags, down the main street in Gaza, right?
Diversity of contradictory political opinions is our strength. Now, so that's how the left operates, and we make fun of it all day long about how, again, contradictory or insane some of the or in some cases just outright dangerous some of the thought processes are. I mean, this is how you get a scenario where the left demonizes people for being, oh, you're a straight white man. Your opinion means not, right? And so we know how they work. On the right, it's a bit more nuanced. You and I had, and when we were driving back from the Homesteaders Conference from North Carolina just a week and a half ago, we had a long conversation in the car about this because you had seen something that I had noticed too on the internet, which is some people would call it anti-Semitic, but I don't actually really think it is on the right. What I think it is a combination of a couple things. The first is and I'm actually very sympathetic to this first point as an American.
Yeah.
The first point is, look, I don't care about foreign conflicts on other continents 3,000 miles away. Why are we spending billions, in some cases hundreds of billions of dollars securing the borders of countries like Ukraine or Israel when we have a border crisis of our own right here? Anybody can just walk across the border, claim asylum, come into the United States, have a kid, and because we have a citizenship law the way that it's written, which is unique to almost any other country in the world, there's a few other countries that have birthright citizenship, but the United States is only one of them. What you can have is foreign huge numbers. I don't mean like legal immigration where you're assimilating like we've traditionally had in the United States, but you can have huge numbers of people pouring across the border, getting American citizenship, and then voting in American elections. And I mean, we have ample evidence throughout history. Look at what happened to the Western Roman Empire. When you have mass migration without assimilation, that is usually catastrophic for a country. And we have a wide open border right now. Why am I being told that it is bad for the United States to care more about, or for Americans to care more about the crisis on our southern border rather than a crisis on a country on another continent 3,000 miles away? I'm very sympathetic to that. I'm also, and then tied into that, there's also the idea that, look, as I brought up earlier, the situation in the Middle East is more volatile than at any point since the Yom Kippur War. I do not want to sacrifice myself or my fellow countrymen to go die in a foreign conflict for some other foreign country's borders. Again, when we have problems in the United States, we have fought enough wars in the Middle East over my entire lifetime.
Yeah.
If there's a serious risk that Iran and Israel actually go to war with each other, not just tit for tat drone strike, but like directly attacking and inflicting actual casualties, there's a really good chance the United States could be dragged into a conflict because of that, and I don't want to see that. So that's one side on the right, and I'm actually very sympathetic to that.
I understand the reasoning there. I understand the reason, because it's not directed at a people group. It's essentially saying that, look, you know, I break it down in the whole idea of, you have Americans that are like, look, I support Israel's right to exist. I want Israel to win, right? But I just don't think it's our obligation to make sure they win. It's not our obligation to lose people making sure that they win. And I can, again, I'm sympathetic to that position. I'm not sympathetic to this other category we've talked about, which is
the other category, and interject whenever you want to, because this is a bit of a delicate topic, and I think it requires a little bit of nuance and a little bit of lead up. You told me in the car ride from North Carolina back to Virginia that, you know, it's as if the right is now increasingly operating almost like on a wartime footing, in the sense that, look, man, when you're in a war, you fight to win. Right? Like, so for example, when we were attacked by the Japanese in World War II, and then a few days after that, Nazi Germany declared war on us. People leave that out. Germany declared war on us. Yeah. Japan declared war on us. We did not declare war on them. And guess what? When they declared war on us, we fought to win. Yeah. We made no distinction. Now, we did not intentionally try to just kill as many. We weren't like the Red Army rolling through Eastern Germany, just shooting people at random in 1945, right? But we made no qualms about attacking civilian targets for military purposes. Yeah. Right? Like when we bombed Germany, we bombed Germany.
Oh yeah, the firebombing of Dresden was pretty brutal.
And it was done for the same reasons that when Sherman was marching through Georgia, he also made no distinction, because he was like, look, civilian infrastructure is used to maintain a military's fighting capacity. Yeah. And if you really want to win a war is hell, man. Yeah. Right? And so when we were at war with Nazi Germany, we bombed every square inch of Nazi Germany, especially their industrial, the industrial heartland of the Ruhr, because we wanted to cripple their military capacity. We made no distinction between, is this private property? Did this person actually vote for Hitler in the 1932 elections? No, we bombed targets. And the right increasingly is feeling like that they're under attack like never before. And in many respects, they are, because the long march through the institutions has been completed mostly. Yeah. Most of our institutions, and we've talked about this at length, have been hijacked by the left at this point and have been openly weaponized against conservatives. Mm-hmm. And so the right is getting to a point where it's like, look, we're in a fight for our lives ideologically. The time for nuance is done here. We should not be making distinction. You're either with us or you are with the cultural Marxists. And so then they look at the voting patterns of Jewish Americans and they see that out of all the demographic groups out there, Jewish Americans are probably close to tied, maybe behind, but close to tied with African Americans in terms of loyalty to the Democratic Party. There's exceptions. I brought that up earlier. Like very Orthodox Jews and Messianic Jews tend to not be that loyal to the Democratic Party. In fact, some of them tend to be quite loyal to conservative causes. But as a whole, the more secular you get on the spectrum of Judaism, right, until you get to like very secular Jews, the more secular, the more on the left they are. And they look at the fact that Jewish people are very successful, right? They're overrepresented in institutions like Hollywood, the media, sometimes academia, certainly Wall Street. And they see that those institutions have become captured by the cultural left and weaponized against the right. And they say, you're my enemy. I don't know how else to look at it. Well, no, I'm fighting the left. You are overrepresented on the left. You are my ideological enemy. And because you are Jewish, I'm now going to direct that opposition to the fact that you are leftists. And I'm going to project that now to the state of Israel and say, well, forget about these people because I'm fighting these people here and they're connected. And so therefore, I'm now going to be hostile to Israel as a state. And then there's also that component of the American first foreign policy, which again, I'm very sympathetic to. So I'm very sympathetic to that first part about the American foreign policy. The second part, it's not that I necessarily agree with it, but I think I believe that I understand why you're seeing this increasing hostility towards Israel or towards Jewish people in the U.S. on the right. I don't think it's just straight up anti-Semitism. I don't think anybody's buying into the traditional anti-Semitism that you see. Like, nobody thinks the Jews are poisoning the wells, right? What I think it is a friend-enemy distinction in terms of political allegiance, and they're concluding, you're my enemy because you are siding with the cultural Marxists.
Well, that's my concern, though, is, again, you're taking an immutable characteristic, and you're now associating it to an ideology. And that is always dangerous. And I would say it's fundamentally in opposition to what I believe as whether you want to call it a conservative or a liberty-leaning conservative, because again, what was supposed to be unique, one of the things that was supposed to be unique and special about the United States is that we don't just automatically assume that if you're X, then Y. Now, people always look back on that and say, oh, really? Well, what about slavery? I get it. We haven't executed it perfectly. What I'm saying is that the philosophical underpinning of what we looked at when we were articulating things like individual liberty, right? Like, people struggle to realize how philosophically relevant and radical it was to say, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That was nuts when it was actually written down on paper, right? The vast majority of people throughout the world had never experienced that, didn't fundamentally believe that. And the idea that you would actually form a government off of that concept, even if you weren't executing it perfectly, was truly revolutionary. That was the most revolutionary component of the American Revolution. And now I'm watching people on the right who generally hold up the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution as fundamental building blocks of what we believe in this country. It's not just legal documents, but also philosophical documents on some level. And abandoning certain aspects of it because, and again, this always happens. This always happens when you get to a point where people feel, the more and more the fight feels like a fight for survival, the less nuanced people are willing to accept in the fight. They're just looking for easy markers in order to identify friend versus foe and go after them. And that concerns me, because you will lose something of yourself, and you will find that the worst elements are able to rise up and dominate in a conflict of that nature. There's a reason why even in American military tradition, you had the Society of Cincinnatus, which was formed out of officers within the Revolutionary War, and it was this idea of Cincinnatus, the old Roman general and aristocrat that took on dictatorial powers for the purpose of putting down a revolt, saving the republic, and then handed the powers back over and went to his farm. And they associated George Washington with that same sort of spirit of, I'm going to fight. I'm going to fight with everything I have, but I'm going to maintain certain principles and certain. I'm going to maintain a certain commitment to certain principles, because I know the moment I cross that line, I've now changed into something else. I've perverted the very thing that I thought I was fighting for. And that's what worries me about this. And I know we're kind of...
This is an important topic, because I see it especially online quite a lot.
Yeah.
In part because there's a bit of overlap between that American first perspective and the friend-enemy distinction.
Yeah.
And I very much agree with the American first perspective. And it's not necessarily that I agree. It's more that I understand the thought process.
Yeah.
But I do think that it is... unfortunately, I think it's important to make distinctions where they're needed, because, again, like, Orthodox Jews overwhelmingly voted for Trump in 2020. Mm-hmm. Like, Messianic Jews, again, Jews that are Christians, overwhelmingly are conservatives. It's not as if, like, every single Jewish person is on the left pushing cultural Marxism, pushing wokeism, pushing the oppressor-oppressed dynamic.
Well, but here's the thing. The reason why I get frustrated when this conversation, and this is the part that I'm starting to get concerned about, is that it almost feels like, and you're not doing this, right? But it almost feels like people get a pass on this when it comes to Jewish people. And I don't understand that, because I don't see the same people on the right who are engaging in this sort of activity doing it to people of other races to the extent that they seem comfortable doing it to Jewish people.
Oh, I've seen it happen a lot with...
I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I said...
Christian associates mostly on X, where it's basically a brawl.
Yeah.
I mean, what did somebody said the other night that X is basically the equivalent of oh gosh, what did you say?
I can't remember. Like,
basically, it's just a big fight.
It's a bar fight.
Yeah,
It's a bar.
that's what
And
it
there we
was.
go. X
Yeah,
is a bar fight.
X is the intellectual
and so
equivalent of
that's
online
pretty
bar
much
fight.
where you're like getting that interaction. It's and so because I'll be honest with you, and I said this earlier, is I was worried that we were going to make too big of hay over this faction of the right who does view it that way, because I literally do not know any in my circle, and I have a lot of conservative friends. Nick and I know probably more conservatives than most people do, and I don't know a single one who hates Jewish people.
No, I don't either.
And is doing the us and them.
It's
like
more
you're on
the
the wrong.
Twitterverse.
And so I'm just saying, I don't want to blow this so far out of proportion. I think the vast majority are the people that are like, why are we getting into any conflict at all? And I think the other people are this tiny fringe element that scream really loudly on X.
Well, let's kind of move this to the fourth section I want to talk about here, because I think to kind of close the loop on what is Israel going to do to respond, I actually think Israel's they're going to have to give a response to, once again, just like Iran had to respond in order to satisfy certain elements within their country and regime, Israel's going to have to respond in order to satisfy elements within their country. And again, that's understandable. You've been attacked, right? It's understandable. I do think Israel, I don't think you're going to see the equivalent of what's going on in Gaza going on in Iran, because logistically, these countries don't border each other, right? And I don't think Israel is going to launch an airborne or an amphibious invasion. But could there be some surgical strikes at various infrastructure within Iran? Yes. Could you see more surgical strikes directed towards certain leaders within the Revolutionary Guard Corps and things like? Yes. But I do think I don't think that this is going to be the catalyst. Personally, I don't think it's going to be the catalyst that throws us all into World War III. Having said that, it's an incredibly volatile time and area. But the fact that Iran telegraphed what they were going to do and then did it the way they did it tells me that Iran is also worried about escalating something to the degree. And can I also say this? This goes back to Tina's point. This is an election year in the United States. I don't think Iran wants to do anything that hurts Joe Biden's reelection chances. Why would you? right? Him being in office represents actually a significant portion of you having access. It drastically increases your GDP. If Trump gets into office, very, very different dynamic. And it's not just a dynamic with respect to how Israel and Iran operate or how the U.S. and Iran operates. It's a different dynamic for how all of the Middle East and Iran operates. Because say what you want about Donald Trump being abrasive or saying things. Donald Trump did more than we'll say the vast majority of presidents in my lifetime with respect to keeping us out of conflicts. To the extent that we did engage in conflicts, they were either existing ones or they were some sort of shoot off of an existing one. And Trump's idea of fighting conflicts was not, we're going to invade your country with 80,000 U.S. troops and set up a multi-decade, peacekeeping. That was not his thing. It was, we're going to kill the bad guys, or we're going to force you to basically stand down. We talked about this before, where Trump understood the difference between this whole nation-building approach to conflict versus punitive approach to conflict. And that's one thing that, again, I think countries like Iran understand. They do not want a Trump presidency. I think other countries in the Middle East, and not just Israel, I think countries like Saudi Arabia and Egypt would also prefer a Trump presidency, because it adds a certain degree of resolve with respect to how actions are going to take place, where you have somebody that they're not going to try to invade and overthrow, but they will target you directly. They will use massive, overwhelming U.S. military power to achieve strategic objectives and do it efficiently and effectively. Because there's nothing more inefficient than we're going to ship over tens of thousands of troops for a multi-decade war, and then leave it in worse conditions. So that's what I think Israel does at this point. As far as when should the U.S. be involved, this is the part where sometimes I get, when I'm talking to libertarian friends of mine as well, like hardcore libertarians, and they kind of take, some of them take an isolationist foreign policy, which is to say they don't think the U.S. should be involved in any of it except for trade. We'll engage in trade, but if you guys want to go start a war, do it. It's none of our business. Then you have ones that are more non-interventionist, which is to say that, and I'm sorry, let me back up. The completely isolationist, it's those are the ones that's more actually conservative, not libertarian. They're we don't even want to do trade, right? We want to limit even trade. The non-interventionists are the ones that's we don't want to get involved in your wars, but we're happy to trade with you, and we're happy to trade with you with no real concern for how you manage your internal affairs. Right. Then you have a different level of non-interventionist, which is to say that we're not looking to get involved militarily in the world, but we do understand that we have strategic objectives and we have allies. And to the extent that we want to protect those relationships, we're willing to engage in economic sanctions. We're willing to engage in other activity. We're willing to limit access to markets based off of the fact that you're using slave labor in order to, provide goods or things like that. And then I don't know, I'm somewhere in that category where I recognize that sometimes it is appropriate to use military power. I'm someone that believes that at times it is appropriate to use punitive strikes. I'm very, very skeptical of foreign aid. By the same token, I also understand that there are times where I don't buy into this notion that the United States can completely retreat from the rest of the world and everything's going to be fine. I think we would more likely find ourselves in some cases in an even bigger problem. The question is what's the appropriate level of intervention, and for what, easy to articulate American strategic interest. And
do letters of marque and reprisal fit in there somewhere?
Yes. I love the ideas of letters of marque and reprisal. I'm actually shocked. There's a really interesting conversation.
First, can you explain what that is for our audience that might not know? Letters
of marque and reprisal were put into the Constitution, which essentially allows the United States to issue a letter of marque or reprisal. So think of it as the Barbary Pirates are the best example in U.S. history of this. It was, okay, the Barbary Pirates keep interfering with American shipping. They're press kinging our ship. They're literally kidnapping our sailors and selling them into slavery. So we're going to issue a letter of marque and reprisal, which basically gives you legal cover to go out and launch punitive expeditions against the Barbary Pirates. Now, Some of that could be done with the U.S. military, and some of it was. That's where you hear, like, when the Marine Corps talks about from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. The shores of Tripoli were a part of the fights with the Barbary pirates. Some of it is also allowing for privateers, which is to say you can have private military or private entities engaging in military action. So when we think of like Sir Francis Drake with the British when he was raiding Spanish galleons and shipping. So it's a little bit different, right? It can be mercenaries. You will see people use this term mercenary way too loosely. A mercenary in the sense of a soldier of fortune, which is someone that essentially fights for highest bidder. Okay. Somebody operating under a letter of marque and reprisal, yes, they're getting compensated by engaging in military style operations.
Maybe more like a bounty hunter would be.
Yeah, that's probably a better way to look at it, simply because there's still legal constraints. Like a letter of marque and reprisal is not an open-ended thing which says you can go kill anybody, in the Barbary states, you rape, pillage, you can't do that, right? Letters of marque and reprisal, there's still rules and a legal structure around it. So I don't think it's fair to call anybody that operated as a defense contractor a mercenary. No, they were hired by the United States government in order to perform a particular task. Some of it was security related. Some of it, in some cases, can be punitive in nature. But that doesn't mean that's just somebody that's selling their military capability to the highest bidder. They still are operating under a legal framework. But no, I would love to see, again, as I look at the sort of foreign policy and as I look at the sort of like assistance because again, I want Israel to win this fight. Is it because I always agree with the Israeli government? Not even close. Do I think the state of Israel has a right to exist? Absolutely. I absolutely think they have a right to exist. And I think they have a right to defend themselves.
And isn't there a danger in not responding? I mean, if they didn't do something and Iran and various other entities were able to just sort of steamroll them all the time, that wouldn't end. It would keep going and it would get worse and worse.
I think so, because if you look at Iran wants to be essentially the global leader of Islam. Then you have other organizations like ISIS that want to reestablish the caliphate. Well, the caliphate was, again, kind of the high watermark of Islamic expansion. It's also interesting when the left talks about this is what decolonization looks like. Like, I got bad news for you, Haas. The Arabs weren't the first in the Levant, right? So it's always, they're always in favor of decolonization, but they always get to set when the date of colonization begins and ends. But if you look at the old caliphate, the caliphate went all the way into what would be modern day Bulgaria, Romania, parts of Hungary.
Well, are you talking about the Ottoman one or the Rashidun / Abbasid
the
Umayyad
Rashidun,
/ Abbasid?
I think if you want to talk about the height of expansion, so yeah, when you were looking at the Iberian Peninsula, so all of Spain and Portugal used to be under Islamic control.
Yeah, that was the Umayyads and the Abbasids.
You even had incursions into southern France and whatnot. Sicily used to be under Islamic control. Greece used to be under Islamic control. The high water mark in Eastern Europe was all the way up to like the gates of Vienna. But if you want to look at areas where they actually controlled, it'd probably be around like Budapest.
The reason I bring this up is because there's a distinction between the first phase of the caliphates and then the Ottomans that came 700 years later, right?
Yeah.
So you had the Islamic conquests in the mid 600s into the 700s, right? All the way up to basically the Battle of Tours.
Yeah,
Charles Martel expels them from everything north of the Pyrenees.
Yeah.
And then you have, at that point, the caliphate kind of stops expanding and then eventually disintegrates for a variety of internal reasons. And then you fast forward through like the Mongol conquest and the Crusades and stuff like that, because the Arab world's still shattered, right?
Yeah.
And then after Timur's empire disintegrates, because the Timurids conquer or subjugate most of Anatolia. After that happens, you have all these little minor Islamic Turkish states in the Anatolia, basically modern day Turkey, right? Yeah. That's where Turkey comes from. And what happens is that one Beylik, which is the Ottomans, end up unifying the area. They fight the Byzantines, conquer it, and then they form the Ottoman Empire, which expands into Europe for the first time, because the original caliphates were actually checked by the Byzantines. They expanded into Spain and India and stuff like that, but they couldn't take Anatolia.
Yeah, they never
Greece.
went past. They typically
take
didn't go past
Constantinople. Yeah.
And even though they go around it,
Yeah.
right? Like
Now, when the Ottomans come along 700 years later, they expand in a different way. The Ottomans don't take Spain, right? Because Spain gets retaken by the Christians with the Reconquista. But they do take North Africa, most of the Middle East, and they expand heavily into Europe.
Yeah.
And that lasts all the way until World War... Well, they start losing some of that in the Balkan Wars, right? But that lasts all the way until about World War I. This is why Albania and large parts of Bosnia are Muslim today.
Yeah.
And, because that wasn't the Abbasids that were doing that. So the point is that, like, there hasn't been a caliphate since 1922, right? Because the Ottomans disintegrate and Ataturk comes along and abolishes, the Ottoman Empire.
Well, and then you actually saw during the height of the Cold War, most of the Arab countries, Saudi Arabia, or not even really so much Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia really didn't start to rise in prominence until oil was discovered. Before it was Egypt, Syria, even Iraq didn't play that prominent a role. But what you saw in those areas was actually more secular. You had secular regimes. I mean, one of the people ask, like, why does the United States give so much money to Israel? Well, obviously there's strong ties between Christians and Jews, modern evangelical Christians and Jews. There's strong ties between the United States helping to establish the Jewish state in 1947. We've always seen them as an ally in the area and somewhat being much more ideologically aligned with the United States and the objectives of the United States. And then during the height of the Cold War, Syria, Egypt were very much partnered with the Russians, with the Soviets. Jordan a little bit less so. They had more of a influence from the British and whatnot. But Israel was always a strategic ally in the region, and it was important for the United States to have a strategic ally in that region. Saudi Arabia also identified more with the United States, one because of massive trade with the UK and the and the fact that the Soviet Union was overtly atheistic, and Saudi Arabia has always been more theologically driven than like Egypt or whatnot. But I know we kind of went like far afield here.
Yeah, I'm looking at the
talking
outline.
about the history.
I was looking at the outline going, I'm not really sure where we're at right now.
Oh, you didn't see the bullet points about talking about the Umayyads and the Abbasids?
I mean, I do know that we do need to have a history lesson every single episode. So, and we got that in.
Let me kind of finish with this, right? The reason why that history is important is because a lot of the leftist narrative on this, especially the very, very anti-state of Israel, what they call the anti-Zionist. It's like, oh, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm anti-Zionist. So you don't think an Israeli state should exist. Where will they go? Right? This is part of the problem where you have people that are making an argument saying, I can be against the existence of the Jewish state in the Levant and not be anti-Semitic. Okay. Let's just entertain for a second that technically that can be true. What do you do with all the Jewish people that live in that area right now? What do you do with them?
Well, because the answer is there just for the taking, because this very same people that say, they're anti-Zionist are the same people that are attacking Jews here in the U.S. They identify in the same way. The same people that are marking buildings and highways and stuff with anti-Zionist, anti-Jew stuff are the same. They're in the same vein, in the same groups of people that are now attacking Jews in the U.S. So yes, they do just want to eliminate the Jews, and that's just what it is. Well, so when they say these things, you know what it means.
Well, and this also begs the question of when is it appropriate for when obviously George Washington warned against entangling alliances. He did not want the United States to be actively involved. Now, we can also agree that the United States plays a very different role in the world in 2024 than it did in, the 1780s. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that, the role we play right now is better, right? Like you can make an argument that the United States should not be as involved in the world as we currently are from a military standpoint. And I do believe that the United States operates way too much in trying to achieve certain objectives that I don't think make any sense. Like the idea of adding Ukraine to NATO. What was the point of that? The whole purpose of NATO was to be a bulwark against the Soviet Empire, the Warsaw Pact. I mean, obviously the Warsaw Pact I think came after, but it was all about an alliance of Western, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. I don't know if anybody's keeping score at home, but a lot of the countries currently in NATO are nowhere near the North Atlantic, right? What was the point of that? Well,
that's when an acronym just nobody thinks about what the acronym means anymore.
But I mean, my point is that I'm completely sympathetic to people that are tired of the U.S. constantly involving ourselves in everything and having to either pay for it or spill the blood to make it happen without any clear benefit to the United States. By the same token, I would say that I do believe that there are times when alliances matter and should be maintained and sustained for strategic reasons and to some degree moral reasons. And people don't like to hear that sometimes, especially on sometimes on the right or on the libertarian side, where it's like, well, no, we'll trade with you, you trade with us, but we don't care about that. I'm like, I don't think that makes sense based off of my understanding of history. I do think that there is practical benefits for the United States to have certain allies, regional allies, trade allies, and that there will be times where it may be appropriate to use military force to come to the aid of those allies. I consider Israel to be an ally. Again, I don't think the United States has the overall moral responsibility for securing Israel. I think that's Israel's responsibility. By the same token, I have no problem providing certain levels of assistance to Israel as a long-term strategic ally to the United States. I think it sends a fairly dangerous message to people when we cannot be trusted on as an ally. I do think we need to be a lot more careful on who we pick as allies. I think we need to be a lot more careful on what our obligation is to the alliances that we've entered into, because from what I can tell, organizations like NATO and others seem to be, countries don't feel the need to live up to their obligations within those alliances because the United States will cover it either monetarily or militarily. And then finally, I would say, going back to Christian's point earlier, I do understand all of the people now, and in some ways consider myself among them, who say, before we get involved in any more, international, conflicts, we need to deal with some of the problems that we have here at home. And if you as an elected official or the chief executive and whatnot are telling me we've got enough money for all of this other stuff, but we don't have enough money or resources to deal with something as significant as our own southern border, then I'm going to tell you you're full of crap. Then at some level, I don't buy it anymore. At some level, I'm starting to wonder what. Please explain to me the horrible thing that happens to the United States if we're not the ones primarily responsible for engaging in this conflict or that conflict. What is it? And if you can't articulate that, and most importantly, if you're not willing to actually say we're going to have Congress vote on it, and I don't mean just allocating funds, but things like going to war. We've engaged in how many wars now for which Congress never declared war? I think it's absurd. I think it's a dereliction of duty on behalf of Congress. I think it's a dereliction of duty on behalf of a lot of our political leaders, especially at the federal level. And so, whereas I am not against coming to the material aid of our allies, you better show me a plan. And you better have worked like hell to make sure the conflict doesn't happen in the first place. And I certainly don't think the United States can say that. I certainly don't think the Biden administration can say that in the Ukraine-Russian war. And I don't think the Biden administration can say that in the conflict that's currently going on between Israel and Hamas and by proxy, Israel and Iran. I think the Biden administration has demonstrated once again that the kind of appeasement policy that we're operating in, usually with nations that openly hate the United States, is not a good strategy. So, I don't know.
My biggest concern right now is, as somebody who doesn't want to see any Americans go and die in the Middle East anymore, any more than I wouldn't want to see Americans go and die in Europe, I'm really... It's not that I'm really concerned, because there's a good chance that nothing will happen. Have you ever seen the nothing ever happens meme? It's this idea that like the news will amp things up to 11 and they will make it seem like there's like earth-shattering events taking place in history-defining moments. And then for 99% of people's lives, nothing has changed.
Yeah.
And so the whole phrase nothing ever happens implies that like, okay, the media will try to spin things into, driving people into hysteria because, right? If it bleeds, it leads.
Yeah.
But ultimately, it doesn't actually change anything. So, like, a good example of something that could potentially be a nothing ever happens moment is actually this. If you think about it, right? Israel attacks this building in Damascus. Iran responds with the drone strikes that 99% of them didn't even reach their target, and the ones that did blew up some, field in the middle of southern Israel and didn't kill anybody. And so you could argue, oh, well, nothing's happened. On one hand, it seems like, oh, this is a big deal because Iran has never directly attacked Israel before, and the Middle East is quite volatile right now, so it seems like something's happening. But on the other hand, Israel could not respond or respond in a way that doesn't drive Iran to retaliate again, which means that you don't get a tit for tat that actually blows up into a full-scale war, in which case nothing happens. It's in the news, but ultimately nothing happens. So we don't ultimately know, no pun intended, we don't ultimately know what's going to happen. But if something does happen, I think that there's a lot of Americans that are worried if something does happen that the United States could be dragged into a war with Iran. And there's a legitimate concern about that. There's a reason why I believe, and you talked about this earlier, there's a reason why the Iranians indirectly, told countries in the Middle East and told other third parties like the Swiss, hey, we're going to do this in 72 hours, because they wanted the word to get to the Israelis and the Americans ahead of time. They wanted to save face, but they also... It's not as if Iran wanted to attack the United States and start a war tomorrow, they could do that.
Yeah.
They could attack one of our warships in the Middle East and start a war if they really wanted to.
Yeah.
But they don't want to, because they know that we would destroy them.
Yeah.
They don't want to be nation built. I don't want to be doing nation building either. So it seems like that we have an area that we might agree. We disagree on a lot of things, but they don't want us to nation build, and I don't want to nation build them. So maybe we can find a way where we don't have to nation build them. So that gives me hope that there's a chance that we can avert war, and I think there's a very good chance that we could avert war. But in the back of my mind, I am worried that things will continue to escalate from here, because we don't know what Hamas's end plan here is. We don't know to what degree the Israelis are going to, how much farther the Israelis are going to have to go to actually end the war in Gaza. We don't know if there's going to end up being a military intervention in southern Lebanon, because Hezbollah keeps escalating tensions as well.
Yeah.
They haven't done as much as Hamas, but the fighting there has escalated a little bit since October 7th. And the Israelis might feel compelled to invade southern Lebanon again. We don't know to what degree the tit for tat back and forth with Iran and Israel, like if that's going to continue or escalate. So there's a lot of what ifs here, or there's a lot of unanswered questions here. And I think the biggest question that Americans have is, are we going to be sucked into a third Middle Eastern war in the last, over the last 30 years?
Yeah, I think, and I think that's fair, and I think it's fair for why Americans want to avoid it. I guess the biggest thing I'm struggling with right now when it comes to looking at U.S. foreign policy in general is that the reason why I think we actually had something. The reason why I think the peace talks in the Middle East were going well was not because the United States completely backed away from the world. It was because we had a foreign policy at the time where people were relatively certain we weren't eager to get involved in any more land wars, but we were also still willing to use the economic and military power of the United States to punish people that were either a threat to us or our allies. And that's incredibly powerful. And that can be powerful for achieving long-term peace in a particular area. And I'm sorry, but the people that tell me that you can't bomb your way to peace. Yeah, you can. Sorry, yeah, we did it in World War II, like we did in World War I. Like this idea that you somehow achieve peace by wishing for it and,
blocking traffic on highways.
Yeah. The way that you actually do it is you go through the process of completely disarming yourself in the hopes that they will go along with the same plan, or that we're going to be isolationist and so too will the other. No, that doesn't work that way. I'm sorry. It doesn't work that way.
You mean you can't just get 200 of your craziest friends with you and go block the Golden Gate Bridge and shut down traffic, which is happening right now?
Yeah. That's why I said blocking highways. That's the most effective way. The left will tell you, Nick, that the most effective way to end the war in Gaza is to block highways and bridges in the United States.
And to get like small city councils and rural, I don't know, California to require a ceasefire.
Yeah. Can you explain that real quick just for the audience? Yeah, this is a funny story.
This one pro-Palestinian, showed up at a city council meeting or a board of supervisors meeting. I think in Southern California. Was it Bakersfield?
Yeah, it was Bakersfield.
Bakersfield, and starts screaming at them that they needed to have like a city resolution calling for a ceasefire in Gaza, and quite literally threatened to murder people in their homes if her demands were not met. So she was gung ho, yelling and screaming at everybody. And then the next pictures, that was how it started and how's it going? Well, yeah, now she's being prosecuted for, threatening people with murder. You can't do that, as it turns out. But again, it just goes to the absurdity of how some people think the world actually works. And here's what I will say is, as much as I am a limited interventionist, right? I do not want, I want the United States' primary interaction with other countries to be through trade and cultural exchange, right? Voluntary cooperation, not coercion, not the threat of coercion. By the same token, I've actually cracked open a history book, and lo and behold, that's not how most of human history is actually transpired. And so to the extent that military force is sometimes required, I want the biggest military. Like, I want the biggest, most effective military out there, because I do believe it is the primary way in order to protect one's national security and national interest. The flip side of that is that it also ends up being an open invitation for chief executives to want to go and give that military a spend, right? Go out there and that's the part where, again, one of the reasons why our founders were actually so skeptical of a standing army is they thought it was a useful mechanism for, the centralization of power and the suppression of one's own citizens. And I get it. I get it. This is difficult. Anybody that's stepping here, it's easy. We just do this or we just do that. I'm sorry. I don't think you have a really grounded understanding of world history and conflict to be pretending that there's no nuance involved here whatsoever. I can say that what I am hoping for is, once again, a chief executive that can carefully distinguish between actual friend and foe, based off of those countries with an ideological hatred for the United States, who simultaneously understands that it is not our responsibility to fight the world's fights, that it is our responsibility to fight our fights, to include the domestic issues that we have to deal with respect to our own security, our own border, our own issues with crime, our own. I certainly get all that, but also looks at it as, when it does come time to strike, you do it in such a way to where it's effective, it's efficient, it minimizes U.S. loss of life and treasure, but it sends a very, very powerful and strong message to our enemies that if you F around, you will find out. And that was one of the things that, again, despite what everybody predicted about a Trump administration initially, he was going to get us involved in World War III. It turns out the guy that is willing to ensure that you win stupid prizes the moment you play stupid games prevents people from wanting to play stupid games, right? And there's benefit to that. So I hope what we're going to see is, again, I want Israel to be able to secure itself. I want Israel to be able to fight back against the various terrorist organizations and countries which are attacking them and have done so repeatedly for decades now. I do think that there is some role for the United States to play in that process, even though we are not ultimately responsible for Israel's security. They have to be the ones primarily responsible for that. But that doesn't mean that there can't be ways that we can assist in that. By the same token, I think we actually need a coherent foreign policy, and I feel like we haven't had one for a long time now. I feel like we are picking fights in areas of the world for which it is not our fight, and then we don't have a coherent strategy or even a coherent explanation. It's always, well, if we don't get involved, who's going to be next? Well, I don't know. That might be a good question to ask before you get us involved, right? Instead of just assuming. It was one of my primary critiques with George Bush when we invade Iraq, and here we are 2-3 years into it, and Bush is wondering, where's the Iraqi Thomas Jefferson? Maybe you should have figured out the answer to that question before you dedicated tens of thousands of troops and U.S. resources. So I'm very sympathetic to a lot of my fellow Americans out there that are like, no, we're done. Prioritize our stuff, and if there's something left over, maybe we can talk about the other things. But we're really, really tired of having everything else prioritized at the expense of the things that all of us are feeling on a day-to-day basis. And we're really getting tired of being told that we're mean or we're sexist or we're racist if we don't agree with you. So my hope is is that, again, Israel wins this conflict. Because I know a little something about the Iranian regime, having fought over in Iraq. I know a little something about terrorist organizations and how they operate. I make a distinction between a military that attempts to follow and operate in accordance with rules of war versus those that look at women and children and civilians as ideal targets because of the terror that it actually instills in a population. I make a distinction between those two things. Not to suggest that a conventional military or military following those guidelines can't make mistakes or engage in collateral damage or even engage in war crimes which need to be prosecuted. But there's a big difference between that and an organization like Hamas or a country like Iran that actually organizes itself to carry out terrorist organizations and operations. By the same token, my gosh, please, for the love of God, we need a chief executive that once again understands that sometimes American force projection doesn't mean we have to invade a country and be responsible for everything. But sometimes it just means that we need to launch a punitive measures in order to achieve U.S. objectives, whether that be on our behalf or our allies, which again should also be on our behalf. If we're maintaining alliances that don't actually provide strategic value to the United States, we need to reevaluate whether or not that alliance needs to exist. But that's where we're at. That's where we're at. I don't think we're about to kick off World War III in the Middle East. I think Iran launched their attacks the way they did for a particular reason. I think Israel is going to launch counterattacks in a much more muted way than some people are anticipating for similar reasons. And unfortunately, we're going to see this kind of slow war of attrition continue in the Middle East. But I do think Israel has every right to go after Hamas and to take out that organization. And I don't think the United States should stand in the way of Israel being able to defend itself. All right. Well, we were a little bit all over the place today. I'm going to admit it, but we were trying to hit this from a lot of different angles, and we were also trying to hit it from angles that aren't necessarily being discussed on every other podcast out there, which is essentially said that it can all be explained this way or it can all be explained that way. This is some of these things are black and white, right? Terrorism is evil. That's it. Assigning negative traits to an entire people group based off of immutable characteristics is evil, right? I don't care what your reasoning is for it. That's evil. You should not do that. But understanding the history of this region, understanding the nuance and how different things can affect a whole host of other issues, ranging from everything from military to diplomacy to trade, that takes a little more than just cheering for your side in a particular, your political side in a particular debate. So hopefully what we've talked about was interesting and maybe even a little bit useful. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next episode.